On the behalf of INTAL, Belgian Peace Movement, and member of World Peace Council, I want to thank the Belgrade Forum for World of Equals for organizing this conference with the aim not to forget the NATO attack on Serbia in 1999. The NATO aggression on Serbia and what they did in the lead up to this aggression was a test case for NATO. Javier Solana, who was the former Secretary General of NATO, in 1996 said the experience of NATO in Bosnia will be used as a model for future NATO operations. And history proved that many new operations came. In my intervention, I want to recall a little bit of the early history of NATO to understand better the real character of this organization so that we can also define better means to fight it. To understand the reason behind the war, it's necessary to look back into history, and specifically into the history of NATO, which was founded in 1949, and still we hear today that it was to counterbalance the Warsaw Pact, which was only created in 1955. So NATO has not a role to do that, it has another role. When it was created, it was a gang of 12 countries who wanted to defend their interests all around the world in opposition to the interests of peoples. Since the beginning, it was dominated by US imperialism, and today it is constituted by 28 countries, and even was discussing expanding up to Colombia, for example. The creation of NATO can only be understood taking into account three enemies that US, European, and Japanese imperialism was facing after the Second World War. First of all, there was the growing influence of the Soviet Union and their allies in the Eastern European countries and the Far East with China and Korea. Next to that, there was the internal enemy. The communist parties, specifically in Western Europe, gained a lot of respect because they were very active and in the forefront of the anti-fascist struggle during World War II. And the third threat was the growing independence struggle of, until that time, colonized or under domination countries in Africa, etc., and which these countries teamed up in 1955 in the Bandung Conference. These three enemies had one important common denominator. Their development was a menace to free investment of US capital. It was a menace to create closed markets for US export, and it was a limitation of US imperialism for the control of natural resources. A strategy that was developed to counter this was developed on three fronts. There was the diplomatic military front, you had the economical front, and you had the ideological front. NATO became, of course, the key tool to fight on the military front. The Korean War was the first warm war waged in the Cold War period. It played an important role in the constitution of NATO, although it was not explicitly a NATO war. Except Iceland, Luxembourg, and Portugal, all the other countries that were in NATO in the beginning participated in the war in Korea, and US imperialism used it to create its presence on European soil and created military bases on European soil, later developed even with the presence of nuclear weapons, etc. NATO's military force was primarily focused on the containment and rollback of the influence of the Soviet Union and their allies, the main enemy of US imperialism for two reasons at the time. First of all, capitalism needed to conquer the huge market that had been closed for investment, export, and plunder. In addition to that, the mere existence of the Soviet Union and socialist countries served as an example and an inspiration for other countries, for other peoples around the world in their struggle for a better life, an alternative for capitalism and neocolonialism. The worldwide propaganda against the Soviet Union and its allies at that time didn't change anything to this respect. Full-scale wars weren't a very good success for NATO and US imperialism at that time. In 1975, the US war machine suffered an important defeat in Vietnam. It was a major setback for them, but as we mentioned before, NATO never comes alone. The combination of propaganda, economic war, the arms race, and finally also the war and proxy in Afghanistan, amongst other issues, led up to the dissolution of the socialist bloc and paved the way for a renewed NATO offensive. Since that day, NATO is explicitly used by imperialism to undermine the sovereignty of countries, and in doing so, undermining any real form of democracy. The new rhetoric accompanied this offensive of humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect. 15 years after NATO intervention in Yugoslavia, the bankruptcy of this European peace propaganda became clear. After the disappearance of the socialist countries in Europe, all European leaders echoed the hopes for a peace dividend. And the integration of the European countries into the European Union would bring peace to the European continent. Today, we face an endless list of wars and interventions. Since the early 90s, we have seen an influx of wars, not less wars. To name only a few, Iraq, Yugoslavia, Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, Afghanistan, Sudan, Lebanon, Georgia, Ivory Coast, Libya, Syria, Mali, Central African Republic, and also today in Ukraine. And even when NATO, like in Libya, was not formally involved in the start of a war, in the start of the military operation, it is always there to precipitate the recolonization of a country by sharing the burden of the recolonization among different imperialist countries. 65 years after its birth, the peoples of Europe and the world are still stuck with an ever more aggressive NATO under the guidance of US imperialism. This shouldn't be of any surprise to anyone in these times of a deepening crisis. But the crisis is at the same time educating the peoples. They suffer from this crisis and have to deal with shrinking wages, shrinking national social spending, etc. On the other hand, we see there is a rise in the development of the war machine with big investments in the renewal of fighter planes, in the renewal of nuclear weapons, with the aim of keeping the control over their competitors and the new competitors that are rising. The growing contradictions of capitalism gives an important opportunity to all progressive forces in the world, and also to the peace movement. And it's up to us, it's our responsibility to step up our efforts to organize. It's our responsibility to step up our efforts to get more people involved in our struggle, and because it's time to send NATO to the place where it belongs, the history books. Please accept our message of solidarity. Down with NATO, down with imperialism, long live international solidarity.